The champagne flute trembled slightly in my grip as Uncle Robert's booming voice cut through the elegant ballroom like a rusty blade. "Ladies and gentlemen, raise your glasses to the Martinez family's greatest disappointment." His words ricocheted off the crystal chandeliers and marble columns of the Grandview Country Club, each syllable designed to draw maximum laughter from the 200 guests seated at their pristine white tables. The orchestra had just finished their waltz, but the silence that followed felt heavier than any symphony. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Isabella Martinez, and at 28 I had grown accustomed to being the family punchline. Tonight, wearing a borrowed navy dress that hung too loose on my frame, I sat at table 12, while my sister Carmen glowed in her $1,000 gown at the head table. The reception hall sparkled with enough diamonds and designer suits to fund a small country, but all I could focus on was the familiar burn of humiliation spreading across my chest like spilled wine. Uncle Robert swayed slightly, his third scotch giving him the liquid courage to perform his favorite routine. He had appointed himself the family comedian years ago, and I had always been his most reliable source of material. "This one here," he continued, gesturing toward me with his crystal tumbler, "has been wandering around like a lost puppy since high school. Can't hold down a job, can't find a man, can't even figure out what she wants to do with her life." The laughter rippled through the crowd in waves. Cousins from Phoenix covered their mouths to hide their giggles. Family friends from the old neighborhood shook their heads with mock sympathy. Even some of Carmen's new in-laws, people who had never met me before tonight, joined in the collective amusement at my expense. I took a slow sip of champagne, letting the bubbles burn my throat, and kept my expression neutral. 28 years of practice had taught me how to weather these storms. Carmen's face flushed pink beneath her professionally applied makeup. She glanced at me with apologetic eyes, but she didn't stop him. She never stopped him. None of them ever did. In the Martinez family, tradition demanded that someone serve as the lightning rod for everyone else's insecurities, and I had been elected to that position before I was old enough to understand what it meant. "Remember when she tried to be a police officer?" Uncle Robert's voice grew louder, encouraged by the responsive audience. "Made it through 3 weeks of academy training before she quit, said it wasn't for her. Then it was nursing school. Lasted a whole semester before she decided that wasn't her calling either. After that came the brief stint as a personal trainer, which ended when she realized she'd have to actually talk to people." The guests erupted in fresh laughter. Mrs. Rodriguez from down the street actually slapped her knee. My brother Diego, Carmen's twin, loosened his designer tie and grinned at his friends from the golf course. Even my mother, elegant in her silver gown, pressed her lips together in what might have been embarrassment or amusement. With her, it was always impossible to tell. I set my champagne glass down carefully on the white tablecloth, next to the centerpiece of white roses and baby's breath that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. The Grandview Country Club demanded perfection in every detail, from the hand-folded napkins to the sterling silver place settings. Carmen had dreamed of this wedding since we were children, and she had gotten exactly what she wanted: a successful attorney husband, a fairy tale ceremony, and a reception that would be talked about in Phoenix social circles for years to come. Uncle Robert was just getting warmed up. He had been the unofficial master of ceremonies at family gatherings for as long as I could remember, and tonight he had a captive audience of Phoenix's elite. "The girl's 28 years old and still living with her parents," he announced, as if this were breaking news. "Never had a boyfriend that lasted more than 2 months. Can't cook, can't clean, can't even keep a houseplant alive. We used to joke that she'd end up as a crazy cat lady, but honestly, I don't think she's responsible enough to take care of a goldfish." The cruelty was casual, delivered with the same tone he might use to comment on the weather. That was the thing about Uncle Robert. He never seemed to realize that his words landed like physical blows. Or maybe he did realize it, and that was precisely the point. He had been the family success story once upon a time, the first Martinez to graduate from college, the one who built a construction empire from nothing. But time had been unkind to him. His business had struggled through the recession, his marriage had ended in a bitter divorce, and his own children barely spoke to him anymore. Perhaps making me the family joke was his way of deflecting attention from his own failures. I thought about standing up and walking out. It would have been the sensible thing to do. But Carmen would never forgive me for ruining her perfect day, and despite everything, I loved my sister. She had never been cruel to me, not intentionally. She simply existed in a different universe, one where everything came easily and success was assumed rather than fought for. In her world, my struggles were incomprehensible, my failures amusing rather than tragic. The ballroom was a testament to that different universe. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns across the marble floors. The walls were adorned with original oil paintings of Arizona landscapes, each one worth more than most people's cars. The guests represented the cream of Phoenix society, judges and business owners, surgeons and real estate moguls. Carmen had married well, very well, and tonight was her coronation as the Martinez family princess. Uncle Robert raised his glass higher, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the air conditioning. But hey, at least she showed up tonight looking almost presentable. Though I have to say, that dress has seen better days. He squinted at me across the room, making a show of examining my outfit. Is that the same one you wore to your cousin Maria's wedding 3 years ago? It was. The navy blue dress with the modest neckline and 3/4 sleeves had been my go-to formal wear for every wedding, funeral, and graduation I'd attended since college. I couldn't afford new clothes for every occasion, not on the income from my string of temporary jobs. But admitting that would only provide Uncle Robert with fresh ammunition. My cousin Jessica, seated 2 tables over in a dress that probably cost more than my monthly expenses, whispered something to her husband, and they both laughed. The sound cut through me like glass. Jessica and I had been close as children, spending summers together at our grandmother's house in Tucson, sharing secrets and dreams. But somewhere along the way, she had grown into the life that was expected of her, while I had wandered further and further from the path the family had laid out for me. The truth is, Uncle Robert continued, his voice dropping to a conspirative whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the ballroom, we've all been wondering what Isabella is going to do with her life. She's not getting any younger, and the clock is ticking. Most girls her age are married with kids by now, building careers, contributing something to society. But our Isabella seems content to drift through life like a leaf in the wind. The comparison stung because it contained just enough truth to be devastating. I had been drifting, in a way. For the past 5 years, since my mysterious disappearance from Phoenix, I had been living a double life that my family knew nothing about. They thought I had been wandering aimlessly from job to job, city to city, unable to find my purpose or my place in the world. They had no idea where I really was or what I had been doing. They had no idea who I had become. My phone buzzed softly in.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
My small clutch purse. A text message from someone whose name would mean nothing to my family, but everything to the men and women who served under my command. General, situation developing in the Middle East. Your guidance requested. I glanced at the message quickly, then slipped the phone back into my purse. Tonight was Carmen's night, and unless the world was ending, my other life would have to wait. Uncle Robert seemed determined to perform his entire repertoire of Isabella jokes. Remember when she decided she was going to be an artist? He asked the crowd, as if they were old friends sharing fond memories. Spent 2 years painting pictures that looked like they were done by a 5-year-old with finger paints. Had a little art show at that coffee shop downtown, and I think she sold exactly 1 painting. To her mother, who felt sorry for her. The laughter was becoming strained now, even among the Martinez relatives who had heard these stories countless times before. Carmen's new in-laws, the prestigious Wellington family, exchanged uncomfortable glances. Dr. Wellington, a prominent surgeon, cleared his throat softly and reached for his wineglass. His wife, a former socialite who now ran a charity foundation, studied her manicured nails with sudden intensity. But Uncle Robert was too drunk and too committed to his performance to read the room. And then there was the yoga instructor phase. He continued, warming to his theme, lasted about 6 months before she realized that teaching people to twist themselves into pretzels wasn't exactly a sustainable career path, though I have to give her credit, she was quite flexible, both physically and morally, if you know what I mean. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. My mother's face went pale beneath her carefully applied foundation. Even Diego looked uncomfortable now, loosening his tie further and avoiding eye contact with his friends. I felt the familiar numbness settling over me, the protective shell I had developed in childhood to survive these public executions. It was a skill that had served me well in other contexts, the ability to disconnect from humiliation and pain, to function despite the emotional assault. Most people assumed that numbness was weakness, an inability to defend myself. They had no idea it was actually a form of strength, a survival mechanism forged in the fires of a childhood spent as the family scapegoat. The irony was exquisite. Here I sat, being mocked for my failures and my inability to amount to anything, while the phone in my purse contained messages from Pentagon officials seeking my counsel on matters of national security. The woman they saw as a drifting disappointment had actually found her calling years ago, in a place and a profession that would have been unimaginable to the people laughing at me tonight. But they would never know that. They couldn't know that. The nature of my real work, my real life, required absolute secrecy from everyone, including family. Especially family. The Martinez clan had never been particularly good at keeping secrets, and loose lips in my profession could cost lives. So I had let them believe what they wanted to believe, had allowed myself to become the family joke in order to protect something far more important than my own reputation. Uncle Robert was reaching his crescendo now, his face flushed with alcohol and the intoxicating power of holding a captive audience. "But you know what they say," he announced, raising his glass in a mock toast. "Every family needs a cautionary tale. Isabella here serves as a perfect example of what happens when you don't apply yourself. When you don't have goals, or ambition, or any sense of direction. She's like a warning label for the rest of us." The silence that followed was different from the previous pauses. This time, even the chronic laughers seemed to sense that Uncle Robert had crossed a line. The cruelty was too naked now, too personal, too vicious to be dismissed as harmless family teasing. Carmen's face had gone from pink to red to pale, and she was gripping her new husband's hand so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. I could have defended myself. I could have stood up and listed my accomplishments. Could have pulled out my phone and shown them the messages from generals and admirals and cabinet members. I could have revealed the truth about where I had been for the past 5 years, about the battles I had fought and the lives I had saved and the respect I had earned from some of the most powerful people in the world. But I didn't. Because the moment I broke my cover, the moment I revealed who I really was, everything would change. Not just for me, but for all of them. The weight of knowledge would crush them, the guilt would destroy Uncle Robert, and the family dynamics that had been set in stone for decades would shatter like glass. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for people is let them continue believing their comfortable lies. Instead, I picked up my champagne glass again and took another small sip. The bubbles had gone flat, just like the laughter in the room. Uncle Robert seemed to finally sense that his audience had turned, and he mumbled something about toasting the bride and groom before stumbling back to his seat. The orchestra, taking their cue from the uncomfortable silence, began playing a gentle waltz to fill the void. Carmen stood up gracefully, her wedding dress rustling like silk rain. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she said, her voice pitched perfectly to carry across the ballroom without seeming to shout. "David and I are so grateful to share this special day with our family and friends. The love and support you've shown us means everything." She was trying to salvage the moment, to redirect attention away from Uncle Robert's cruel performance and back to the celebration. It was a classy move, exactly what you'd expect from someone who had been groomed for situations like this since childhood. Carmen had always been the golden child, the one who did everything right, who never caused problems or embarrassed the family. She was everything I was supposed to be and had never quite managed to become. As the guests began to applaud politely for Carmen's gracious words, I noticed a commotion near the ballroom entrance. The massive doors, carved from solid oak and decorated with brass handles that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, had opened to admit what appeared to be hotel staff. But something about their bearing seemed different, more purposeful than the usual catering crew. The men and women entering the ballroom moved with a precision that spoke of military training. Their posture was too straight, their alertness too sharp for civilian employees. They wore black suits and white shirts, the kind of anonymous formal wear that allowed them to blend into upscale events without drawing attention. But I recognized the subtle signs that marked them as something other than hotel staff. My phone buzzed again, more insistently this time. 3 messages in rapid succession, all marked with the highest priority designation. I glanced around the room, noting the positioning of the new arrivals, the way they had spread themselves strategically around the perimeter of the ballroom. Professional habit made me catalog exit routes and potential threats, even as part of my mind remained focused on the social disaster unfolding at the head table. Uncle Robert, perhaps sensing that his moment in the spotlight was fading, decided to make one final attempt at capturing the crowd's attention. He stood up again, swaying slightly, and tapped his fork against his wine glass with enough force to create a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the gentle music. Wait, he called out, his words slightly slurred, but still carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. I'm not quite finished with my toast. There's one more thing I want to say about our dear Isabella. The collective groan was almost audible. Even the most tolerant guests were clearly tired of Uncle Robert's performance, and Carmen looked like she might cry. Her new husband, David Wellington, placed a woe-er-vicen, protective hand on her shoulder and whispered something in her ear that made her nod gratefully. But Uncle Robert was beyond the reach of social cues now. The alcohol had stripped away what little filter he normally possessed, and the power of holding an audience had gone to his head like a drug. You see, he continued, gesturing broadly toward my table, Isabella represents everything that's wrong with her generation. No work ethic, no commitment, no sense of responsibility. She's had every opportunity handed to her on a silver platter, and she's squandered every single one. The cruelty was breathtaking in its completeness. He wasn't just mocking my failures anymore. He was rewriting my entire existence as a cautionary tale about moral weakness and social decay. The worst part was that some of the older guests were nodding along, as if his words contained profound wisdom about the decline of modern youth. I felt something shift inside me, a subtle change in the emotional landscape that had governed my response to these attacks for so many years. The numbness was still there, the protective shell that allowed me to function under fire. But underneath it, something harder was crystallizing, something that had been forged in places far more dangerous than the Grandview Country Club ballroom. The men and women in black suits had completed their positioning around the room. They stood with their hands clasped behind their backs, eyes alert, ready for whatever signal they were waiting for. Most of the guests hadn't noticed them yet, too focused on Uncle Robert's performance to pay attention to the subtle changes in the room's dynamics. My phone buzzed again. This time, instead of a text message, it was a call from a number that made my pulse quicken. The display showed only a series of digits, but I knew that number by heart. It was a direct line to people who could reshape global politics with a single conversation. I declined the call and slipped the phone back into my purse, but my mind was already shifting gears, moving from the social realm into the professional mode that had become second nature over the past 5 years. The timing was curious, almost too coincidental to believe. Major international incidents didn't usually unfold during family weddings, but in my line of work, coincidences were rare and timing was everything. Uncle Robert was building toward his grand finale, his voice growing louder and more theatrical with each passing moment. The sad truth is, he declared as if he were delivering a sermon to a congregation of believers, some people are just destined to be disappointments. Some people will never amount to anything, no matter how many chances they get or how much support they receive. Isabella is proof that you can lead a horse to water but you can't make it drink. The metaphor was clumsy and mixed, but the message was clear enough. In Uncle Robert's worldview, I was fundamentally flawed, constitutionally incapable of success or achievement. It was a narrative that had been building for years, accumulating weight and momentum with each retelling until it had become accepted family mythology. What Uncle Robert didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the horse had found its own water source years ago. While they had been telling stories about my failures, I had been earning the respect and trust of people whose names appeared in history books. While they had been laughing at my inability to find direction, I had been given command responsibilities that most officers spend decades working toward. The irony was so complete it almost approached poetry. Here I sat, being lectured about failure and lack of achievement, while wearing a dress that concealed scars from combat operations in 3 different countries. The woman they saw as directionless had actually been leading men and women through some of the most challenging missions in modern military history. But the secrecy wasn't just professional necessity. It was also personal protection. If my family knew the truth about my life, about the danger I regularly faced, and the weight of the responsibilities I carried, it would destroy them. My mother would never sleep peacefully again. Carmen would worry herself sick. Even Uncle Robert, for all his cruelty, would probably be consumed by guilt if he understood what he was really mocking. So I had let them believe what they needed to believe. I had allowed myself to become the family disappointment in order to protect them from a truth they couldn't handle. It was a sacrifice that few people would understand, and one that I had never intended to reveal. But as Uncle Robert launched into what appeared to be his closing argument, something fundamental began to change in the ballroom. The men and women in black suits were no longer trying to blend into the background. They had moved closer to the central area of the room, their attention focused on something that the wedding guests couldn't yet see. The massive oak doors opened again, and this time there was no mistaking the nature of the new arrivals. They entered in formation, their dress blue uniforms pristine, their bearing unmistakably military. The red and gold insignia on their sleeves caught the light from the crystal chandeliers, and the sound of their synchronized footsteps created a rhythm that cut through Uncle Robert's monologue like a blade through silk. The lead figure, a woman with silver hair and more ribbons on her chest than most people see in a lifetime, scanned the room with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to assessing situations quickly and accurately. Her gaze swept across the elegant tables, the confused guests, the wedding party frozen in tableau at the head table, before finally settling on me. Recognition flashed in her eyes, followed by something that might have been relief. She nodded once, a sharp, professional acknowledgement, before turning to address the room at large. Uncle Robert, oblivious to the changing dynamics around him, was still talking. "The point I'm trying to make," he continued, his voice beginning to compete with the sound of military boots on marble floors, "is that some people are just born to be followers, not leaders. Some people will always need others to take care of them, to make decisions for them, to—" He stopped abruptly as the full weight of the situation finally penetrated his alcohol-fogged awareness. The room had gone completely silent, except for the measured cadence of approaching footsteps. Every guest had turned to stare at the military procession moving through the ballroom with the unstoppable force of a tide. The woman with the silver hair stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her words crisp and clear in the sudden silence. "I apologize for the interruption, but we're looking for General Martinez." The name hung in the air like a physical presence. Several guests looked around in confusion, clearly wondering if perhaps Uncle Robert's military service in the National Guard decades ago had somehow earned him a general's rank. Others seemed to think there had been some mistake, that the soldiers had entered the wrong event at the wrong venue. But I knew better. I knew exactly why they were here and what they needed. The string of urgent messages on my phone had been building toward this moment, and the timing of their arrival during Uncle Robert's performance felt less like coincidence and more like cosmic justice. I stood up slowly, the borrowed navy dress suddenly feeling like armor rather than a costume. Every eye in the room turned toward me, but for the first time in my life, the attention didn't feel like a burden. It felt like recognition. "I'm General Martinez," I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly in the hushed ballroom. "What's the situation?" The words transformed the room like a spell. The woman with the silver hair snapped to attention, followed immediately by every military person in the ballroom. "General," she said, her voice respectful but urgent, "we have a developing situation that requires your immediate attention. The Secretary of Defense, sends his apologies for the timing, but she stopped, herself, clearly aware that she was discussing classified matters in front of civilian witnesses. But the damage, if you could call it that, was already done. The truth had been revealed, and there was no taking it back. Uncle Robert's mouth hung open like a broken gate. His wineglass slipped from his nerveless fingers and shattered against the marble floor, the sound echoing through the silence like a gunshot. Carmen had gone completely pale, her bouquet trembling in her hands. Even David Wellington, sophisticated attorney that he was, looked like he had been struck by lightning. The transformation in the room's energy was immediate and total. Guests who had been laughing at Uncle Robert's jokes moments before now stared at me with expressions ranging from shock to awe to something approaching fear. The family disappointment had just been revealed as something none of them had ever imagined possible. I looked around the ballroom, taking in the faces of people who had known me since childhood, who had watched me grow up and had written me off as a failure. The numbness was gone now, replaced by something cleaner and sharper. Not revenge, exactly, but a sense of completion, as if a story that had been unfinished for decades was finally reaching its proper conclusion. "I'll need 5 minutes to change," I told the woman with the silver hair, my voice shifting automatically into the tone of command that had become second nature over the past 5 years. "Have transportation standing by, and brief me on the situation as soon as we're mobile." She nodded crisply. "Yes, ma'am. The motorcade is waiting, and we have a secure communications link to the Pentagon." I turned to Carmen, who was still staring at me as if I had just sprouted wings. "I'm sorry," I said softly, meaning it completely. "I never wanted to ruin your wedding. This wasn't supposed to happen." She shook her head slowly, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Isabella," she whispered, "I don't understand. What's happening? What's this about?" There were so many things I could have said, so many explanations I could have offered, but the urgency of the situation and the nature of my responsibilities didn't allow for long conversations or detailed revelations. "I'll explain everything later," I promised, but right now, duty calls. I started toward the ballroom exit, the crowd parting before me like water. The military personnel fell into formation around me, a protective escort that transformed my departure from an exit into a procession. As I reached the massive oak doors, I paused and looked back at Uncle Robert. He stood frozen beside his overturned chair, his face a mask of confusion and dawning horror. The man who had spent the evening mocking my failures and limitations was beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. For the first time in my life, Uncle Robert had nothing to say. I didn't gloat or offer any parting words. The revelation itself was enough, and anything I might have added would have diminished its impact. Sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is simply walking away with your dignity intact. The last thing I heard as the doors closed behind me was the sound of my mother beginning to cry. The ride to the secure facility passed in a blur of streetlights and urgent briefings. As the armored vehicle cut through Phoenix traffic with police escort, I found myself caught between two worlds that had never been meant to intersect. My phone buzzed constantly with updates from the Pentagon, while my mind kept drifting back to the expressions on my family's faces as I walked out of that ballroom. Colonel Sarah Chen, the woman with the silver hair who had led the military delegation, sat across from me in the vehicle's communications center. She had been my mentor years ago, back when I was just another promising young officer trying to prove herself in a male-dominated field. Now she was briefing me on a situation that could reshape international relations for decades to come. "The satellite imagery came in an hour ago," she explained, her fingers dancing across the secure tablet that displayed classified intelligence reports. 3 hostile vessels crossed into territorial waters near the straits. Initial assessment suggests they're testing our response protocols, but the implications run much deeper than a simple provocation. I absorbed the information while simultaneously processing the emotional whiplash of the evening's events. 20 minutes ago, I had been sitting in silence while Uncle Robert eviscerated my character in front of Phoenix's social elite. Now I was being briefed on a potential international incident that required immediate strategic intervention. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same family members who had spent years mocking my apparent lack of direction were probably still sitting in that ballroom, trying to process the revelation that their family disappointment was actually one of the youngest generals in military history. The cognitive dissonance must have been overwhelming for them, especially for Uncle Robert. But there was no time to dwell on family drama when national security was at stake. I had learned long ago to compartmentalize, to separate personal emotions from professional responsibilities. It was a skill that had served me well during my rapid rise through the ranks, and it was serving me now as we raced through the desert night toward a situation that demanded my complete attention. The journey to this moment had begun 5 years earlier, though the roots stretched back much further than that. Growing up as the Martinez family scapegoat had been a different kind of training, a harsh education in resilience and emotional control that most people never experience. Every public humiliation, every casual cruelty, every dismissive laugh had been forging something inside me that I wouldn't fully understand until much later. The summer after my 20th birthday, when the family's disappointment in my various false starts had reached a crescendo, I made a decision that would change everything. I had been working as a barista at a coffee shop in downtown Phoenix, listening to my mother's daily phone calls about when I was going to get my life together, when I saw the recruitment poster taped to the window of the military office across the street. The image was simple but powerful. A woman in dress blues standing at attention, her eyes focused on something beyond the camera's frame. The caption read, "Lead from the front," and something about those 4 words resonated in a way that nothing else had for years. I stared at that poster for weeks, walking past it twice a day on my way to and from work, until finally I found the courage to cross the street and walk through those doors. The recruiter, Sergeant Williams, was a patient man who had probably seen thousands of confused young people walk through his office over the years. He didn't judge my scattered work history or my lack of clear direction. Instead, he asked me what I wanted to accomplish with my life, and for the first time in years, I found myself talking about dreams instead of failures. "I want to matter," I told him, the words surprising me with their honesty. "I want to do something that makes a difference, something that requires everything I have to give." He nodded, as if he understood exactly what I meant. "The military isn't for everyone," he said carefully. "It's demanding in ways that most people can't imagine. But for the right person, someone who's willing to push beyond their perceived limitations, it can be transformative." The conversation lasted 3 hours. By the end of it, I had signed papers that would commit me to 8 years of service, beginning with basic training at Parris Island. When I called my family to tell them about my decision, the reaction was exactly what I had expected. "The military?" my mother had said, her voice rising to that particular pitch that indicated maximum distress. "Isabella, honey, you can barely manage your own life. How are you going to handle military discipline?" Uncle Robert had been even more direct. "This is just another one of her phases," he told anyone who would listen. "She'll wash out in a few weeks and come crawling home, just like always. Mark my words, this girl doesn't have what it takes to be a soldier." Even Carmen, who tried to be supportive, had expressed doubts. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, during one of our late-night phone conversations. "It seems so unlike you. You've never been interested in anything military before." She was wrong about that, actually. I had always been fascinated by military history, by stories of leadership under pressure and courage in impossible circumstances. But I had learned early not to share those interests with my family, who would have found yet another way to mock what they didn't understand. The night before I left for basic training, I sat in my childhood bedroom surrounded by the detritus of 20 years of false starts and abandoned dreams. Art supplies from my brief painting phase gathered dust in one corner. Textbooks from my aborted attempt at nursing school were stacked on my desk. The personal training certification I had never used was framed on the wall, a monument to another failed attempt at finding my place in the world. But as I packed the few belongings I was allowed to bring to Parris Island, I felt something I had never experienced before: certainty. For the first time in my life, I was moving toward something instead of running away from my latest disappointment. The future was unknown and probably difficult, but it was mine to shape. Parris Island was exactly as brutal as advertised. The drill instructor showed no mercy to the confused young woman from Phoenix who had arrived with more emotional baggage than practical skills. The physical demands were crushing, the mental pressure relentless, and the emotional challenges unlike anything I had ever faced. But something remarkable happened during those 13 weeks of hell. The same resilience that had allowed me to survive years of family mockery began to serve me in this new context. Every time a drill instructor screamed in my face, I thought about Uncle Robert's casual cruelty and realized that I had been preparing for this my entire life. The other recruits struggled with the dehumanizing aspects of military training, the way drill instructors stripped away individual identity in order to build something new. But I welcomed the erasure of Isabella Martinez, family disappointment. If the military wanted to tear down who I had been and rebuild me into something stronger, I was more than willing to cooperate. The first real test came during the 3rd week, when drill instructor Martinez, no relation despite the shared name, decided to make an example of me during weapons training. I had been struggling with the technical aspects of field stripping in M16, my hands shaking with nerves and fatigue, when he began one of his legendary tirades. "Private Martinez," he bellowed, his voice carrying across the entire training area, "you handle that weapon like you're afraid it's going to bite you. What kind of pathetic excuse for a Marine are you going to make if you can't even clean your rifle properly?" The public humiliation was designed to break me down, to force me to either find the steel inside myself or wash out like so many others before me. But as he continued his verbal assault, describing in vivid detail all the ways I was failing to meet Marine Corps standards, I felt something unexpected: gratitude. This was just another version of Uncle Robert's performance, another powerful man using his position to belittle someone he perceived as weak. But unlike those family gatherings, I now had the tools to respond. Instead of retreating into numbness, I channeled my anger into focus. Instead of accepting the humiliation, I used it as fuel. I field stripped that rifle faster than I had ever managed before, my hands moving with a precision that surprised even me. Then I reassembled it in record time, each component clicking into place with mechanical certainty. When I finished, I looked drill instructor Martinez directly in the eye and waited for his next challenge. He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression. Not approval exactly, but recognition. He had been testing me, and I had passed in a way that he hadn't expected. "Better," he said simply, before moving on to terrorize the next recruit. But that single word carried more weight than any praise I had ever received from my family. The transformation didn't happen overnight. There were still moments of doubt, still times when the voice in my head sounded suspiciously like Uncle Robert telling me I wasn't good enough. But gradually those voices were drowned out by something stronger, the growing confidence that came from meeting challenges I had never thought possible. The physical training became less brutal as my body adapted to demands that had once seemed impossible. The mental pressure became manageable as I learned to compartmentalize stress and focus on immediate objectives. But it was the leadership training that truly revealed what I was capable of becoming. During the 8th week, our platoon was assigned a complex tactical exercise that required coordinated movement across difficult terrain under simulated enemy fire. The designated squad leader, a recruit from Texas who had seemed like natural command material, froze under pressure and left our unit exposed in an open field. Without thinking, I took charge. "Martinez to Anderson, take your fire team left and establish overwatch from that ridgeline," I called out, my voice carrying over the sound of blank ammunition and smoke grenades. "Johnson, suppress that machine gun nest at 2 o'clock. Everyone else, follow me." The tactical situation unfolded with crystalline clarity in my mind. I could see the optimal movement patterns, the vulnerabilities in the enemy position, the timing required to execute a successful flanking maneuver. Most importantly, I could feel the other recruits responding to my commands, their confidence growing as they realized someone had taken control of the chaos. We completed the exercise in half the allotted time with 0 simulated casualties. More importantly, we had functioned as a unit in a way that surprised even our instructors. After the debriefing, drill instructor Martinez pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Private Martinez," he said, his voice stripped of its usual intimidating edge, "where did that come from?" I didn't have a good answer for him. The truth was that I had surprised myself as much as anyone else. The ability to see tactical situations clearly and communicate effectively under pressure had emerged from somewhere deep inside me, a capability I had never known existed. "I don't know, sir," I admitted. "It just felt natural." He nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something he had suspected. "You've got command presence," he said. "That's not something you can teach. Either you have it or you don't, and you definitely have it." The rest of basic training passed in a blur of increasing responsibility and growing confidence. I was selected for advanced leadership training, then recommended for officer candidate school. Each achievement built on the last, creating a momentum that carried me far beyond anything I had ever imagined possible. My family's reaction to my graduation from Paris Island was predictably mixed. They attended the ceremony, of course, because it was a family obligation. But I could see the confusion in their eyes as they watched me march in formation with my fellow Marines, as they listened to the drill instructors praise my performance, as they realized that their family disappointment had somehow transformed into something they didn't recognize. Uncle Robert's comment after the ceremony was typical. "Well, I guess even a broken clock is right twice a day." He couldn't simply acknowledge my success without diminishing it somehow, without finding a way to maintain his narrative about my fundamental inadequacy. But his words had lost their power to hurt me. The same resilience that had helped me survive his cruelty had been refined and strengthened by military training. I had learned to derive my sense of worth from achievements rather than approval, from competence rather than acceptance. Officer candidate school at Quantico was even more demanding than basic training, but by then I had found my rhythm. The academic challenges that had once seemed insurmountable were now manageable obstacles. The leadership scenarios that broke other candidates were puzzles to be solved through clear thinking and decisive action. I graduated third in my class and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps. The transformation from family scapegoat to military officer was complete, but it was only the beginning of a journey that would take me to places I had never dreamed of seeing. My first assignment was to Camp Pendleton, where I was given command of a platoon of Marines who were preparing for deployment to Afghanistan. Most of them were older than me, more experienced in military life, and initially skeptical of their young female lieutenant. But I had learned at Paris Island that respect was earned through competence, not given based on rank or gender. The deployment to Helmand Province was a baptism by fire that tested everything I had learned during training. The complex political situation, the constant threat of improvised explosive devices, and the challenge of winning hearts and minds while maintaining security required a level of judgment and adaptability that no classroom could prepare you for. But somehow, I thrived in that environment. The same analytical mind that had allowed me to see through tactical exercises became invaluable for understanding the intricate tribal dynamics of Afghan society. The communication skills I had developed during leadership training helped me build relationships with local elders who had initially been suspicious of American intentions. Most importantly, the emotional resilience that had been forged during years of family dysfunction served me well when dealing with the psychological pressures of combat leadership. When other officers struggled with the weight of life and death decisions, I found that I had already developed the mental toughness required to function under extreme stress. The breakthrough moment came during my 6th month in country. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value target was meeting with local insurgent leaders in a compound near our forward operating base. The mission required a delicate balance of speed and stealth, with multiple contingency plans for various scenarios. I was selected to lead the operation, despite being one of the most junior officers in the unit. The decision raised eyebrows among some of my peers, but Colonel Davidson, our commanding officer, had been watching my performance closely and believed I had the right combination of tactical acumen and leadership ability for the mission. The operation was a complete success. We captured the target without firing a shot, gathered invaluable intelligence about insurgent networks, and most importantly, brought all our people home safely. The after-action report praised my planning, my decision-making under pressure, and my ability to adapt to changing circumstances in real time. But it was the response from my Marines that meant the most to me. These battle-hardened professionals, who had initially viewed me with skepticism, now looked at me with something approaching reverence. I had proven myself in the crucible of combat, and they knew they could trust me with their lives. The commendation that followed the mission was my first major military decoration, but it represented something much more significant than career advancement. It was proof that the transformation that had begun at Paris Island was real and lasting. The family disappointment had become a combat leader who could be trusted with the most critical missions. My second deployment took me to Iraq, where the security situation was even more complex and dangerous. The sectarian violence that plagued the country required a different kind of leadership, one that combined tactical expertise with cultural sensitivity and diplomatic skill. I was promoted to captain and given command of a company operating in Anbar province. The mission was to work with local police forces to a pretext ras, establish security in areas that had been controlled by insurgents for years. It required building trust with Iraqi officials who had good reason to be suspicious of American promises, while simultaneously hunting down terrorist cells that threatened the fragile peace process. The challenge was enormous, but I had learned to embrace complexity rather than fear it. Each day brought new problems that required creative solutions, new relationships that needed to be carefully cultivated, and new decisions that could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. One of the most difficult situations arose when intelligence indicated that a corrupt police chief was providing information to insurgent groups while accepting American support for his operations. The easy solution would have been to simply cut ties with his unit and find new partners, but that would have left a security vacuum that the insurgents could exploit. Instead, I developed a careful strategy to gradually replace key personnel in his organization while maintaining the appearance of cooperation. It took months of patient maneuvering, but eventually we were able to remove the corrupt elements without destabilizing the entire structure. The operation required a level of political sophistication that most military officers never develop. I had to understand not just the tactical situation, but the broader cultural and historical forces that shaped Iraqi society. I had to be simultaneously a warrior, a diplomat, and a social scientist. But perhaps most importantly, I had to be a leader who could inspire confidence in people from vastly different backgrounds and cultures. The Marines under my command needed to see that I understood the complexities of their mission and had the judgment to navigate them successfully. The Iraqi partners needed to trust that I would keep my word and protect their interests, even when it wasn't convenient for American objectives. The success of these operations led to my selection for the Army War College, where I spent a year studying strategic planning and international relations. It was during this period that I began to understand how my personal experiences had prepared me for military leadership in ways that traditional officer training could never accomplish. The emotional intelligence that had been developed through years of navigating difficult family dynamics was invaluable when dealing with coalition partners who had competing interests and conflicting agendas. The resilience that had been forged through public humiliation served me well when facing criticism from senior officers who questioned my unconventional approaches to complex problems. Most importantly, the ability to remain calm under pressure, which had been developed as a survival mechanism during Uncle Robert's verbal assaults, became a crucial asset when making decisions that could affect the lives of thousands of people. My thesis at the War College examined the role of cultural intelligence in counterinsurgency operations, drawing on my experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq to develop new frameworks for understanding how military force could be used more effectively in complex political environments. The paper attracted attention from senior Pentagon officials who were grappling with similar challenges in other parts of the world. Before I knew it, I was being invited to brief cabinet-level officials on strategies for dealing with failed states and terrorist organizations. The transition from tactical leadership to strategic planning was both exhilarating and terrifying. The decisions I was now involved in could reshape entire regions, affect millions of lives, and determine the course of international relations for decades to come. But somehow, the same instincts that had served me well at the platoon and company level remained valuable at the strategic level. The ability to see patterns in complex situations, to understand how different actors would respond to various pressures, and to communicate effectively with people from diverse backgrounds were skills that translated across all levels of military leadership. My promotion to major came with assignment to the Pentagon, where I worked on contingency planning for various crisis scenarios around the world. The work was fascinating but also sobering, as I came to understand the true complexity of global security challenges and the limitations of military solutions to political problems. It was during this period that I began to develop the reputation for innovative thinking that would define the rest of my career. When senior officials were struggling with particularly difficult strategic problems, I was increasingly called upon to provide fresh perspectives and creative solutions. The promotion to lieutenant colonel brought command of a battalion preparing for deployment to Syria, where the civil war had created a humanitarian catastrophe and a security nightmare for American forces trying to combat terrorist organizations while avoiding entanglement in the broader conflict. The mission required a level of political sophistication and cultural understanding that pushed my capabilities to their limits. We were simultaneously fighting ISIS terrorists, supporting Kurdish allies, avoiding conflict with Russian forces, and trying to provide humanitarian assistance to civilian populations caught in the crossfire. The complexity was overwhelming, but I had learned to break down impossible problems into manageable components. Each day, I focused on achievable objectives while keeping the broader strategic picture in mind. Each decision was made with careful consideration of its potential consequences across multiple dimensions of the conflict. The success of our operations in Syria led to my selection for promotion to colonel and assignment to a joint task force dealing with emerging threats in the South China Sea. The mission was to develop strategies for maintaining freedom of navigation while avoiding military confrontation with Chinese forces that were increasingly assertive in their territorial claims. This was geopolitical chess at the highest level, where a single miscalculation could trigger a conflict between superpowers. The pressure was enormous, but I had spent years learning to function effectively under stress that would paralyze most people. The irony of my situation was becoming increasingly apparent. While my family continued to view me as a disappointment who couldn't manage her own life, I was actually responsible for managing some of the most complex and dangerous security challenges facing the United States. The promotion to brigadier general came with assignment to lead a classified task force dealing with cyber warfare and emerging technological threats. The details of this work were so sensitive that I couldn't discuss them with anyone outside the intelligence community, including my own family. This secrecy created an additional layer of isolation from my personal life. Not only did my family not understand what I did for a living, they couldn't understand because the nature of my work required absolute confidentiality. But the professional satisfaction was immense. I was finally operating at a level where my strategic thinking and leadership abilities could have maximum impact. The decisions I was involved in would shape national security policy for years to come, and the responsibility was both humbling and exhilarating. The final promotion to Major General came with assignment as commander of all Marine Corps forces in the Pacific, a position that made me one of the most senior officers in the American military. The appointment was controversial in some circles, not because of any questions about my competence, but because I was younger than most generals and had risen through the ranks faster than traditional career paths typically allowed. But my track record spoke for itself. Every assignment had been completed successfully, every challenge had been met with innovative solutions, and every unit under my command had performed at levels that exceeded expectations. The irony was perfect and complete. The family disappointment who couldn't hold down a job had become one of the most powerful military leaders in the world. The directionless young woman, who had been mocked for her lack of ambition, was now responsible for strategic planning that could affect the security of nations. But the secrecy that protected national security interests also protected my family from knowledge that would have been devastating to them. Uncle Robert's cruel jokes would have taken on a different meaning if he had understood that he was mocking someone who outranked most of the generals he had seen in movies. As the armored vehicle pulled up to the secure facility where the current crisis would be managed, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. Every humiliation, every setback, every moment of doubt had been preparing me for situations exactly like this one. The family that had written me off as a failure had actually produced one of the most successful military officers of our generation, but they would never know that, because the nature of my success required secrecy that was more important than personal vindication. Colonel Chen was already coordinating with the intelligence teams that would brief me on the developing situation. In a few minutes, I would be making decisions that could affect the course of international relations for decades to come. But first, I allowed myself one moment to savor the cosmic justice of the evening's events. Uncle Robert's performance had been interrupted by a truth that he could never have imagined. and the family joke had been revealed as something far beyond their comprehension. The transformation was complete, and the reckoning had finally come. The secure communications center hummed with activity as I stepped out of the armored vehicle and into the kind of controlled chaos that had become my natural habitat. Banks of monitors displayed real-time intelligence feeds from around the globe, while teams of analysts worked at stations equipped with the most advanced technology the military had to offer. The familiar scent of strong coffee and electronic equipment filled the air, a combination that had become as comforting to me as the smell of home cooking might be to others. Colonel Chen moved efficiently through the briefing process, her years of experience evident in the way she prioritized information and highlighted the most critical decision points. The situation in the South China Sea had evolved rapidly over the past 6 hours, transforming from a routine territorial dispute into something that could potentially spiral into armed conflict between major powers. As I absorbed the classified intelligence reports, my mind automatically began formulating response strategies, while simultaneously processing the surreal events of the evening. Less than an hour ago, I had been enduring Uncle Robert's latest performance, playing the role of family disappointment with practiced resignation. Now I was being briefed on a crisis that required the full weight of my strategic expertise and command authority. The cognitive dissonance was profound, but manageable. Years of compartmentalization had taught me to separate personal emotions from professional responsibilities, to function effectively regardless of external circumstances. But tonight felt different somehow, as if the revelation at Carmen's wedding had broken down barriers that I hadn't even realized existed. For the first time in 5 years, my two worlds had collided in spectacular fashion. The carefully maintained secrecy that had protected both my mission and my family's peace of mind had been shattered by circumstances beyond anyone's control. There was no going back to the comfortable fiction that had allowed Uncle Robert to mock me with impunity while I quietly managed international crises from the shadows. The intelligence briefing revealed a complex situation involving 3 Chinese naval vessels that had crossed into disputed waters near Taiwan, accompanied by what appeared to be a coordinated cyber attack on regional communication networks. The timing suggested a calculated provocation designed to test American resolve, while the administration was distracted by domestic political issues. But the surface-level analysis missed the deeper strategic implications. As I studied the tactical positions and reviewed the communication intercepts, I began to see patterns that the initial assessment had overlooked. This wasn't just a territorial provocation or a simple test of American resolve. It was the opening move in a much larger strategic gambit that could reshape the entire balance of power in the Pacific. I requested additional intelligence reports and began cross-referencing the current situation with similar incidents over the past 18 months. The pattern that emerged was both elegant and terrifying in its implications. What appeared to be isolated incidents were actually coordinated elements of a comprehensive strategy designed to gradually erode American influence in the region without triggering direct military confrontation. The genius of the approach lay in its incremental nature. Each individual provocation was carefully calibrated to fall just below the threshold that would justify a strong military response, but the cumulative effect was to establish new facts on the ground that fundamentally altered the strategic landscape. My phone buzzed with a priority message from the White House Situation Room. The president wanted my assessment within the hour, along with recommendations for both immediate tactical responses and longer-term strategic options. The weight of responsibility was enormous, but it was also exhilarating in a way that few people outside the military would understand. This was why I had endured years of public humiliation from my family. This was why I had allowed them to believe I was a failure, while I quietly built one of the most distinguished military careers of my generation. Every insult, every dismissive comment, every casual cruelty had been forging the emotional steel that allowed me to function effectively in moments like this. As I worked through the strategic implications of various response options, my mind kept returning to the expressions on my family's faces as I walked out of that ballroom. The shock, the confusion, the dawning realization that everything they thought they knew about me was wrong. Uncle Robert's wine glass shattering against the marble floor had been a perfect metaphor for the destruction of their comfortable assumptions. But there was no time for personal satisfaction when national security was at stake. I pushed aside thoughts of family drama and focused entirely on the crisis at hand. The next few hours would determine whether this situation escalated into something that could threaten global stability, and the decisions I made would play a crucial role in that outcome. The tactical options were limited but significant. We could respond with a show of force, moving additional naval assets into the region to demonstrate American resolve. We could escalate through diplomatic channels, coordinating with allies to present a united front against Chinese aggression. Or we could pursue a more subtle approach, using the same incremental tactics that our adversaries employed to gradually reassert our position without triggering direct confrontation. Each option carried enormous risks and potential benefits. A show of force might deter further aggression, but it could also escalate the situation beyond our ability to control it. Diplomatic responses might preserve face for all parties involved, but they could also be interpreted as weakness and invite further provocations. Subtle countermeasures might be the most effective long-term strategy, but they required patience and coordination that could be difficult to maintain under political pressure. After 2 hours of analysis and consultation with intelligence experts, I made my recommendation to the White House. The situation required a layered response that combined elements of all three approaches, carefully sequenced to maximize effectiveness while minimizing the risk of uncontrolled escalation. The implementation would require precise coordination between multiple agencies and international partners, but it offered the best chance of resolving the immediate crisis while establishing a framework for deterring future provocations. The President accepted my recommendation, and within minutes, orders were flowing through secure channels to commanders around the globe. As the initial crisis response got underway, I finally had a moment to consider the personal implications of the evening's events. The revelation at Carmen's wedding had not only shocked my family, it had fundamentally altered the dynamics that had governed our relationships for decades. My phone rang with a call from an unknown number, but the Phoenix area code told me everything I needed to know. I declined the call and watched as it was immediately followed by 3 more from different family members. They wanted explanations, answers to questions they had never thought to ask. But those conversations would have to wait. The nature of my work required complete focus and absolute confidentiality, even from family members who now knew the truth about my career. The knowledge that I was a general would only raise more questions about what I actually did, questions that I could never fully answer. The irony was almost poetic. For years, they had demanded to know why I couldn't get my life together, why I couldn't find direction or purpose like my siblings. Now they knew that I had found both direction and purpose in abundance, but the nature of that purpose meant they could never really understand it. Colonel Chen approached with an update on the implementation of our response strategy. The first phase was proceeding smoothly, with Allied forces beginning coordinated movements that would demonstrate resolve without appearing overtly threatening. The communication networks that had been targeted by the cyber attack were being systematically restored, using countermeasures that would also serve as a subtle message about our defensive capabilities. But the most delicate aspect of our response involved back-channel communications with Chinese military leaders, conveying our understanding of their strategic objectives, while making clear that further escalation would carry unacceptable costs. These conversations required a level of diplomatic sophistication that few military officers possessed, drawing on years of experience in complex international negotiations. As I reviewed the initial reports from these diplomatic contacts, my phone buzzed with a text message from Carmen. "Isabella, please call me. I don't understand what happened tonight, but I need to know you're okay." The message was simple but loaded with emotional complexity. Carmen had always been the golden child, the one who succeeded effortlessly at everything she attempted. For the first time in our lives, I was the one with secrets she couldn't fathom, accomplishments she couldn't match, responsibilities that dwarfed her own considerable achievements. But there was genuine concern in her message, a recognition that the sister she thought she knew had been revealed as someone entirely different. The family dynamics that had been set in stone for decades were now completely fluid, and none of them knew how to navigate this new reality. I sent a brief response assuring her that I was safe but couldn't discuss details, then turned my attention back to the developing situation. The Chinese vessels were beginning to withdraw from the disputed waters, suggesting that our initial response had achieved its intended effect. But intelligence reports indicated increased activity at military installations across the region, raising questions about whether this was a genuine de-escalation or simply a tactical pause. The next phase of our response would be crucial. We needed to demonstrate that American resolve was not merely reactive but proactive, that we could anticipate and counter their strategic moves before they fully developed. This required a level of strategic thinking that went far beyond traditional military planning, incorporating elements of economics, psychology, and political science. As I worked on refining our longer-term strategy, I couldn't help but think about Uncle Robert's performance earlier that evening. His casual assumption that I lacked ambition or direction had been so fundamentally wrong that it bordered on the absurd. While he had been building construction projects around Phoenix, I had been helping to construct the strategic framework that maintained global stability. The contrast was striking but also instructive. Uncle Robert's worldview was limited by his own experiences and assumptions, unable to conceive of achievements that lay outside his narrow definition of success. He measured worth in terms of visible accomplishments and social recognition, completely missing the reality that some of the most important work in the world was done in secret by people whose names would never appear in newspapers. But his limitations were also his protection. If he had truly understood what I did for a living, if he had grasped the weight of the responsibilities I carried and the dangers I regularly faced, it would have destroyed him. His cruel jokes had been possible only because of his ignorance, and that ignorance had been a mercy to both of us. By dawn, the immediate crisis had been successfully managed. The Chinese vessels had withdrawn to their territorial waters, the cyber attacks had been neutralized, and back-channel communications had established parameters for avoiding future escalations. The response had been textbook perfect, demonstrating American capabilities while providing face-saving opportunities for all parties involved. But success in crisis management was only the beginning of the strategic challenge. The underlying tensions that had created the crisis remained unresolved, and the precedents established by our response would influence international relations for years to come. The real work would involve sustained diplomatic and military efforts to prevent similar crises from developing in the future. As I prepared to return to Phoenix for the inevitable family conversations that awaited me, I reflected on the strange symmetry of the evening's events. The same strategic thinking that had allowed me to manage an international crisis had been developed through years of navigating family dysfunction. The emotional resilience that served me well in military leadership had been forged in the crucible of public humiliation and casual cruelty. Uncle Robert's jokes had been intended to diminish me, to keep me in my assigned role as the family disappointment. But they had actually been preparing me for challenges that he could never have imagined. Every insult had been building the psychological armor that allowed me to function under pressures that would crush most people. The drive back to the Grandview Country Club gave me time to consider how I would handle the conversations that lay ahead. My family deserved some explanation for the evening's revelations, but the classified nature of my work severely limited what I could tell them. They would have to be satisfied with partial truths and careful omissions, a reality that would only deepen their confusion about who I really was. The country club's parking lot was nearly empty when I arrived, with only a few cars remaining from the wedding reception. The elegant ballroom that had been filled with laughter and music just hours earlier was now dark and silent, the remnants of Carmen's perfect wedding reduced to scattered decorations and empty tables. But the family cars were still there, indicating that my relatives had remained after the other guests departed. They were waiting for me, probably sitting in one of the club's private rooms, trying to process what they had witnessed and formulate the questions they wanted to ask. I sat in my car for a few minutes, gathering my thoughts and preparing for conversations that would be unlike anything we had ever shared. For 5 years, I had maintained a careful separation between my professional and personal lives, protecting both my mission and my family through strategic deception. But that separation was no longer possible. The truth about my career was out, even if the details would always remain classified. The family dynamics that had been based on their perception of me as a failure would have to be completely recalibrated around the reality of my actual achievements. As I walked toward the country club's entrance, I could see figures moving behind the windows of the private dining room where we had held family gatherings in the past. Carmen was there, still in her wedding dress but with her elaborate hairstyle beginning to come undone. My mother sat beside her, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Diego paced near the windows, gesticulating as he spoke to someone I couldn't see from this angle. Uncle Robert was slumped in a chair at the far end of the room, a whiskey glass in his hand and his bow tie hanging loose around his neck. Even from a distance, I could see that the evening's revelations had aged him dramatically. The confident performer who had held court just hours earlier was gone, replaced by a broken man struggling to understand how fundamentally wrong he had been about everything. I paused at the entrance to the dining room, taking in the scene before announcing my presence. These people had shaped my childhood, had provided the emotional context that influenced every major decision of my adult life. Their cruelty had been unintentional in many ways, a product of their own limitations rather than genuine malice. But their inability to see my potential, their casual dismissal of my capabilities, had also been a gift in disguise. It had forced me to develop inner resources that I might never have discovered if I had received the support and encouragement I once desperately wanted. I knocked softly on the doorframe, and every head in the room turned toward me. The expressions I saw were a mixture of confusion, embarrassment, pride, and something that might have been fear. They were looking at someone they had known their entire lives but had never really seen. Carmen was the first to speak. "Isabella," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we need to understand what happened tonight. We need to know who you really are." The question hung in the air between us, loaded with decades of misunderstanding and missed opportunities. They wanted answers that I couldn't fully provide, explanations that would make sense of revelations that had shattered their fundamental assumptions about reality. But I could give them something. Not the complete truth, which would remain classified until the day I died, but enough truth to help them understand that their family joke had become something extraordinary. Enough truth to help Uncle Robert comprehend the magnitude of his mistake, and enough truth to help all of us begin rebuilding relationships that had been based on false premises. "I'm still your daughter," I told my mother gently. "I'm still your sister," I said to Carmen and Diego. "I'm still family," I said to Uncle Robert, whose eyes couldn't quite meet mine. Then I sat down at the table where they were gathered and began to tell them as much of my story as national security would allow. It would be enough to help them understand that the woman they had underestimated was actually someone who had exceeded their wildest dreams of success. The family disappointment had become a family hero, and the reckoning that had begun in the ballroom would continue until they fully grasped the transformation that had taken place right under their noses. Uncle Robert finally looked up from his whiskey glass, his face a map of regret and dawning comprehension. "Isabella," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "I need you to know that I never meant to hurt you. I thought I was just joking around, just family teasing." The apology was inadequate for years of systematic humiliation, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, a beginning is enough to build something better than what came before. As the sun rose over Phoenix, painting the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson, I began the long process of helping my family understand who I had become. The secrets would remain, but the shame was finally over. The girl they had mocked for lacking direction had found her true north, and it had led her to heights none of them had ever imagined possible. The transformation was complete, the reckoning was at hand, and the future held possibilities that none of us had dared to dream. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.